My name is Rachel. I am 33 years old. And last Christmas, I thought everything was finally falling into place. I had a promotion at my agency, and David, the man I love, had just asked me to marry him. I walked into my parents' house that day with my heart full, believing maybe this time I would finally be celebrated. But instead of joy, I found myself trapped at a dinner table, where every word reminded me I would never measure up. My brother was praised like a hero. My sister was adored like a star. And when my turn came, my mother looked straight at me and said something so cruel that the entire room fell silent. Everyone waited for me to break, but I did not. I did something else. Something quiet, but powerful enough to change the way my family would see me forever. What I revealed that night left them stunned. And if you stay with me until the end, you will understand why my mother's words became the best thing she ever gave me. That was the weight I carried with me as I walked through the door that Christmas afternoon, stepping back into the same house I had known all my life. A house that smelled of tradition and held memories both comforting and painful. Christmas of 2022 was supposed to feel like a celebration. I drove from Boston back to Springfield that morning, the highway quiet under a pale winter sky. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, the windows glowed with warm light, and the faint sound of Bing Crosby drifted through the frosted glass. I carried a bottle of wine in one hand and a box of carefully wrapped gifts in the other, my heart pounding with the secret I had been keeping for 2 months. I wanted to tell my family about the promotion I had earned at my agency. And more than that, I wanted them to know that David had asked me to marry him. I thought, maybe, this Christmas would be different. Inside, the house smelled of roasted turkey and cinnamon rolls. The dining room table was already set with the same ivory china my mother always used for holidays. My brother Mark was standing near the fireplace, telling our uncles about a complicated surgery he had performed last week at Boston General. He looked sharp in a tailored gray sweater, his watch gleaming when he moved his hand. My sister Kelly, younger than me by 3 years, sat near Grandma Eleanor, animatedly describing how she had convinced a jury to side with her client. The room buzzed with praise and admiration. I hung my coat and walked in with a smile. Dad looked up from carving the ham and grinned. "There's my girl," he said warmly, and gave me a quick hug. Mom appeared from the kitchen, still wearing her red cashmere sweater and pearls, her lips pressed in a thin line. "Rachel, you finally made it." I was only a few minutes late, but the way she said it made me feel as if I had already failed. I set down the gifts and joined the table, trying to swallow the nervous excitement that had followed me all the way from Boston. Dinner began with chatter about Mark's work, about Kelly's law firm in downtown Boston, about Cousin Janet's plans to buy a condo. The food passed around the table. Mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, green beans with almonds, all the staples of our holiday meals. I listened and added polite comments, waiting for the right moment. My father asked Kelly another question. My mother leaned in, glowing with pride. And once again I felt myself shrinking into the background. Still, I told myself, I would have my chance. I would tell them soon. The conversation circled back to Mark's hospital and Kelly's law victories. My Aunt Susan laughed. My Uncle Frank raised his glass, and my mother rested her hand proudly on Kelly's shoulder. I kept my hands folded neatly on the table, my engagement ring tucked inside my purse, the words forming silently in my mind. I imagined how I would say it. I imagined their surprised faces, maybe even a smile from my mother. For a fleeting second, I let myself believe it. Then it happened. Between bites of turkey and a sip of wine, my mother turned her eyes on me, her expression sharp and cold. "You're the most useless child we have." The words sliced through the noise of the room, louder than the music, sharper than the clinking silverware. The laughter stopped. Forks froze midair. Every head turned toward me. A wave of heat shot through my chest. My ears rang. For a moment I thought I might drop my glass. Inside, I felt years of small cuts and disappointments surge forward all at once. Every dismissal, every comparison, Every time I had been made to feel invisible. My hands trembled under the table where no one could see. I pressed my fingers together until they hurt, fighting back the urge to either burst into tears or shout. Grandma Eleanor's brows furrowed, her mouth opening as if to scold. But no words came. Dad's knife hovered above the ham, his eyes wide in disbelief. Kelly glanced at her phone, then back at me, a faint smirk tugging at her lips, as if she almost expected this scene. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair but said nothing. The silence stretched long and heavy. I drew in a slow breath, steadying myself. My heart raced but my face remained calm. Instead of exploding the way everyone must have expected, I forced a small smile and lifted my glass of water. I nodded once, as if acknowledging something trivial, and took a sip. I set the glass down carefully, the clink echoing in the silence. Then I did something that none of them expected. I smiled faintly, almost politely, and leaned back in my chair. My hand tightened under the table, my fingernails digging into my palm. But outwardly, I looked composed. Everyone waited for the storm, for me to lash out or beg for kindness. Instead, I simply continued eating, lifting a forkful of mashed potatoes as if nothing had been said at all. The table remained quiet for a long beat. Dad cleared his throat, shifting in his chair. Grandma Eleanor let out a slow sigh. Somewhere in the kitchen, the old grandfather clock ticked loudly, its sound marking each second that passed. The tension was suffocating, but I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. Not tonight. Not anymore. I queued slowly, deliberately, while my mother reached for her wine, her hand trembling just slightly. No one spoke, no one dared to, and as I sat there, tasting nothing, feeling the weight of their eyes on me, I told myself that this moment was only the beginning. I had known for as long as I could remember that my place in this family was never the same as Mark's or Kelly's. Growing up in Springfield, our little Cape Cod-style house always echoed with my mother's approval when Mark brought home another science ribbon from middle school, or when Kelly played the baby and got away with anything. When Mark won the 6th grade science fair with a project on solar energy, Mom baked a cake and called relatives to brag. I was there too, clapping and smiling. Though I had just gotten an A on my history paper that no one asked about, the cake never had my name written on it. When Kelly was 8, she dropped one of Mom's porcelain figurines, and it shattered on the hardwood floor. She burst into tears, and Mom gathered her up in her arms, whispering that it was fine. She was still her little angel. I was 12 that year, and just the week before I had knocked over a glass of water on the kitchen counter. Mom's voice had gone cold and sharp as she told me to learn to be careful and stop being careless. The double standard wrapped around my childhood like a constant reminder that no matter what I did, I was invisible unless it was to be corrected. I learned quickly to busy myself with what I could control. I spent hours after school in the library, doing extra reading, writing essays, pushing myself for perfect grades. My father, Thomas, sometimes noticed, giving me a proud smile when he saw a paper with a red A at the top. But his voice was often drowned out by my mother's focus on Mark's future as a doctor and Kelly's endless potential. The imbalance wasn't loud or violent. It was subtle, a steady drip that wore away at my confidence. Year after year, by high school, I was juggling schoolwork with part-time shifts at the local grocery store on Main Street. I stocked shelves, rang up customers, and saved every dollar I could. I told myself that if I bought thoughtful gifts for birthdays and Christmas, maybe my mom would finally look at me the way she looked at my siblings. I remember spending weeks saving up to buy her a pearl bracelet for her birthday. When she opened it, she smiled politely, then turned to gush over the sweater Kelly had picked up last minute at the mall. That smile, the one that stretched wide for them and thinned when it turned to me, became the measure of my worth in her eyes. There were small moments when I thought maybe things would change. Sophomore year, I made honor roll every quarter, and the principal called home to tell my parents. Mom hung up the phone and said dinner would be late because she had to iron Mark's shirt for a debate competition. She did not even mention the call, Kelly. At that moment, Was playing piano in the living room and hit the wrong key. Mom rushed in, laughing, saying she was adorable for trying. My achievements passed like whispers in the hallway, quickly drowned out by louder applause for someone else. In college, I chose marketing at Northeastern in Boston. I fell in love with the classes that taught me how stories could move people, how strategy and creativity could blend to change a brand, maybe even a life. When I told Mom over the phone, her pause was heavy enough that I could hear her disappointment without words. Finally, she said that marketing was just playing with slogans and pictures. She asked why I could not be more like Mark, who was heading to medical school, or Kelly, who was studying pre-law. I hung up that night and cried in my dorm room. But the next morning I got up and went back to class. It was the first of many times I would learn to hold my head high in spite of her voice in the back of my mind. By senior year, I was exhausted but proud. I had pulled late nights, written research papers, interned at a small agency, and somehow kept my GPA at the top of my class. The day of my graduation in Boston, the spring air was bright and alive. I wore my cap and gown, clutching my diploma with honors, grinning for the camera as my friends hugged me. I searched the crowd for my mother, hoping this time would be different. Maybe she would finally see me. After the ceremony, I walked up to her with the diploma still in my hand, my father smiling at my side. She glanced at it, nodded, and said, "Well, I still think marketing isn't a real career." The words sank into me deeper than any criticism before. My friends' parents were hugging their kids, shouting with pride. I stood there with my diploma in my hand, and my mother's disapproval echoing in my ears. That sentence followed me long after the cap and gown were put away. It sat at my desk when I started my first entry-level job. It whispered in my ear when I stayed late at the office trying to prove myself. It weighed on me when I sent her pictures of my first apartment and got back only a comment about the neighborhood not being as nice as Kelly's. For years it was the soundtrack of my ambition, the reminder that no matter how high I climbed, it would never be enough to earn her pride. Looking back now, as I sat at that Christmas table in 2022, her words about me being useless were not new. They were only louder, more public. A blade she had sharpened for decades, finally thrust in front of everyone. But as I remembered each moment of being overlooked, dismissed, and compared, I realized something was different this time. I was no longer a child desperate for approval. I had built a life on my own in Boston. A career, a love, a future that she had no control over. The ache of the past still lingered. But it no longer defined me. It fueled something else. Something I was finally ready to show. When I graduated and settled into Boston, I promised myself I would not just survive, I would thrive. I took the job at a mid-sized agency downtown, starting as a coordinator and working my way up until I was promoted to senior marketing manager. The hours were long, and the pressure was constant. But I poured everything into that career. At night, when the office lights dimmed, I opened my laptop again to work on freelance, digital ad campaigns for small businesses that could not afford bigger firms. Every extra dollar I made was carefully set aside, not for vacations or luxuries, but for my family. It began with a phone call in early 2019. My mother's voice was tight and anxious. The car payment was overdue, and she said she was afraid they would lose it. I remember standing in my small apartment kitchen, staring at the checkbook I kept in a drawer. I had just enough to cover my rent and groceries for the month, but I told her I would help. That first transfer was $1,200. She promised it would only be for a month, maybe 2, until things balanced out. It became every month. For 2 years. On the 15th, I set up the payment, watching my account shrink, telling myself this was how I proved my worth. In the spring of 2020, when the pandemic strained everything, Dad ended up in the hospital with gallbladder surgery. Insurance covered some but not all of it, and the bills piled high. Mom called again, crying on the phone. I remember gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. Then, clicking through my bank app, I sent $5,000 that night. I did not hesitate. Because it was Dad, and because that was what I had trained myself to do. I told myself it was family. That family helped each other, even when the help went unnoticed. That same year, Kelly was finishing law school, and she needed to take the bar exam. Her trust fund had already been spent on a trip to Europe the summer before, and Mom told me with a weary sigh that Kelly had no way to cover the fees. The words came like a script I already knew. Could I step in just this once? I wired $2,500, telling myself that maybe if Kelly passed and succeeded, Mom would finally see me as part of that success too. The text I got from Kelly afterward was short. A simple thanks. No details. It stung, but I pushed it aside. By 2021, Mark was struggling with student loans from his residency. He was already working at the hospital, already being praised at every dinner. But behind the scenes, his finances were crumbling. Mom told me it would crush him if people found out. She said if I could just help him through this one rough patch, it would mean the world. I sent $6,000 from the savings I had been building for a down payment on a house. Mark never knew. He kept smiling at Christmas dinners, talking about his bright future, while I quietly worked more late nights to fill the hole I had dug in my own bank account. I still see myself in that little apartment in Boston in the winter of 2021. Snow pressed against the window panes. The radiator rattled, and I sat at my desk with my laptop open, the Wells Fargo page glowing. My checking account balance showed barely $300 left after rent and utilities. My heart hammered as I typed in another transfer to my mother's account. $1,200 for the car. My finger hovered above the button, my throat tight. Then I clicked confirm. The money was gone, and I sat back, staring at the ceiling, whispering that this was how I would earn her love. It had to count for something. I told no one. Not my friends. Not David. Not even Dad. I carried those numbers inside me like hidden scars, telling myself that each sacrifice was an investment in belonging. Each time my mother praised Mark or Kelly, I reminded myself quietly that it was my money keeping their lives stable, my effort holding the family together. I thought, maybe if I gave enough, one day she would say she was proud. One day she would call me essential instead of invisible. Instead, what I heard at that Christmas table was the opposite. The word useless was not just cruel, it was blind to every sacrifice I had made. I sat there, remembering each transfer, each night I worked overtime, each dream I put on hold. I could almost feel the weight of my empty account again, the sting of watching my savings vanish, and yet I had kept going, convinced that my mother's approval was worth the cost. As I chewed the food in front of me, tight, I realized that all those years of quiet sacrifice had built something different. It had built proof. Proof I was not useless at all. Proof that without me, the car would have been repossessed, the hospital bills unpaid, the bar exam out of reach, the loans still drowning my brother. I was the one who had held them together. Quietly, steadily, invisibly, and the irony was that they had no idea. I lowered my fork and glanced around the table, my eyes settling on my mother's hand as it tightened around her wine glass. She had no idea what I carried. None of them did. But they would. And this time, I would not let it be hidden anymore. What my mother had always refused to see, David saw from the beginning. We met 2 years earlier at a fundraiser for a literacy program in Boston. He was a high school English teacher visiting from Portland, Oregon, where he had grown up and where he taught. I was at the event because my agency had helped design the campaign materials. He noticed me standing near the refreshment table, flipping through a stack of brochures, and we struck up a conversation about books. He spoke with an easy warmth that felt like a relief after years of walking on eggshells at home. From that first night, he listened in a way I had never experienced. When I told him about a campaign I had been working on for a local restaurant, he leaned in, genuinely curious, asking how I came up with the slogan. No one had ever asked me questions like that. Every small win I shared, he celebrated. If I landed a new client, he took me out for dinner. If I worked late on a freelance project, he showed up with coffee. Where my mother dismissed my career as playing with pictures, David saw strategy, skill, and creativity. By the fall of 2022, we had built a rhythm together. He lived in Portland during the school year, but he visited often, and we spent long weekends exploring New England. That October, the leaves had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, and he suggested a trip to New Hampshire. We drove through winding roads, stopping at small towns where pumpkins sat on porches, and the smell of apple cider drifted from roadside stands. The air was crisp, and for once, my mind was quiet. On the second morning, we hiked up a trail near Franconia Notch. The sky was clear, the sun cutting through the branches, and my boots crunched against fallen leaves. When we reached the overlook, the valley below spread out in a patchwork of autumn colors. David stood beside me, his breath visible in the cool air. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. My heart leapt before he even spoke. "Rachel," he said softly, "you are the strongest, most generous person I know. You work harder than anyone, and you never give yourself enough credit. I want to spend my life reminding you how much you matter." Then he opened the box, and inside was a simple solitaire diamond that caught the sunlight and scattered it across the rocks. My throat closed, and tears blurred the mountains around us. No one had ever spoken to me like that. No one had ever seen me that way. I said yes, through a rush of tears and laughter. He slipped the ring onto my finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for me all along. We stood there in the cold, holding each other. The valley spread out beneath us. I remember thinking that for once in my life, I did not need to prove anything. I was enough. Just as I was. That night in the small inn where we stayed, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the ring on my hand. The lamplight made it sparkle, and I felt a wave of emotion I could not contain. I whispered to myself, "At least one person sees me. At least one person knows I am worthy." It was not about the diamond or the proposal. It was about the way he believed in me without question. The way he never doubted my value. It was a kind of recognition I had been chasing my whole life. And now it was in my hands. We kept the engagement quiet at first. David suggested we wait until the holidays to tell my family. Wanting to do it in person, I agreed, though a part of me hesitated, knowing how easily my mother dismissed the milestones of my life. Still, I wanted to believe. I wanted that Christmas to be the moment when I could finally share joy with my family, without it being overshadowed. I wanted to show them the man who loved me, the man who thought I was more than enough. In the weeks after, David called every night, asking about my work, my day, my plans. He never let a single accomplishment slip by unnoticed. When I told him about the freelance project I had finished for a coffee shop in Boston, he said he wished he could frame the ad because he was so proud. When I admitted I was nervous about leading my new team at the agency, he reminded me that I had already proven myself 10 times over. His faith became the anchor I leaned on. As I sat at that Christmas table later that year, my mother's cruel words still hanging in the air, I thought about that mountaintop in New Hampshire. I thought about the ring hidden in my purse, waiting for the right moment to be shown. My mother had just called me useless in front of everyone, but David's voice echoed louder in my heart. He had told me I was strong, generous, worthy, and for the first time, I believed him more than I believed her. I shifted in my chair, forcing myself to breathe slowly. Around me, the clinking of forks had resumed, conversation stumbling awkwardly back to safer topics. No one dared look me in the eye for too long. Beneath the table, I touched the small box in my purse, reminding myself it was real. No matter what they said, no matter how they looked at me, I carried proof of something bigger. I carried the certainty that I was loved, valued, and seen. Mom quickly filled the silence with her voice, her favorite shield against anything uncomfortable. She leaned toward Aunt Susan and began recounting in detail how Mark had been invited to assist with a complex heart procedure last month. Her eyes glowed with pride as she described how the chief of surgery had personally praised his steady hands. The table leaned in, nodding and smiling, as if no one remembered what had been said only moments earlier. I sat quietly, listening, my fork moving through food I could hardly taste. When that story faded, she turned seamlessly to Kelly. She told Grandma Eleanor about the case Kelly had argued in federal court and how she had managed to sway the jury with her eloquence. Kelly tilted her head modestly, but her smile was sharp. Mark reached across the table to clink his glass against hers in congratulations. The chorus of admiration rose again, each compliment layering on top of the last until the room was warm with their collective pride. I slid the wrapped box I had brought toward Mom. It was not expensive, but it was filled with weeks of effort. Inside was a leather-bound album I had created, filled with old photographs I had scanned, cleaned, and printed. Years of family birthdays, graduations, summer vacations, and Christmas mornings were arranged carefully with handwritten notes under each picture. I had stayed up late night after night in my apartment in Boston, restoring faded images, determined to give them something that held the story of us all. Mom pulled off the wrapping paper and opened the album. She flipped through the pages slowly, pausing once or twice, then closed it with a polite smile. "How nice," she said lightly. "This must have taken you some time." "It did," I answered quietly. "About 40 hours, maybe more." Before I could finish, she turned to Mark. "Show everyone that new watch your colleague gave you." Mark lifted his wrist proudly. The gold face caught the light, and the room hummed with fresh admiration. Everyone leaned closer, asking how much it cost, where it was from, whether it was Swiss-made. Mark grinned, enjoying the attention, while my album sat forgotten beside Mom's plate. Kelly reached for her glass of wine and looked at me with a smirk. "You always pick unusual gifts," she said, her tone sweet but cutting, thoughtful, but unusual. My chest tightened, but I forced my lips into a faint smile. The urge to defend myself rose, to remind them of the nights I had spent carefully putting it together, but I swallowed it down. The room was too loud with laughter over Mark's watch to hear me anyway. I shifted back in my chair and folded my hands in my lap. I watched Mom lean closer to Kelly, asking about the spa weekend she had booked for them as a Christmas present. The excitement spilled into plans about dates and travel arrangements, their voices bright. My father gave me a small glance across the table, his eyes soft with apology, but he said nothing. I traced the edge of my napkin, steadying myself. The album, the hours, the care, all brushed aside as if it were a passing gesture. Kelly's jab still lingered in my ears. I wanted to feel anger, but what I felt more strongly was a strange clarity. It was all so predictable. The way my gifts would be dismissed, the way my presence would fade into the background, while Mark and Kelly shone in the light of my mother's pride. The conversation swirled back around to Mark's work at the hospital. He described an upcoming conference in Chicago where he would be presenting on surgical innovations. Mom clasped her hands together, her voice nearly trembling with pride. When Kelly interjected with a story about a dinner with senior partners at her law firm, Mom leaned in again, her admiration flowing as easily as the wine. She kept sipping. I sat there, invisible, my album still unopened past the first few pages. My efforts brushed aside, my pulse slowed. Instead of fighting for a place in the spotlight, I let myself observe, memorizing every word, every expression. The more I watched, the clearer it became. I glanced down at my purse, resting by my feet, feeling the weight of the velvet box inside. The diamond ring was small, simple, but it symbolized something no one at that table could take away. I was engaged to a man who saw me, who believed in me, who did not need me to prove my worth through money or sacrifices. The voices around me rose again as Mark lifted his wrist once more to show the watch to Uncle Frank. Kelly laughed, tossing her hair back as Grandma patted her hand proudly. I breathed slowly, letting the noise wash over me. I knew my moment was coming. Not yet, but soon. For now, is up still, almost serena. As the storm of pride and comparison swirled around me, they could not see it. But I was no longer scrambling for approval. I was waiting, steady and patient, for the right time to finally shift the weight of the room. The word useless still rang in my ears like a bell that refused to fade. I felt its echo settle over the table, heavy and suffocating, as if everyone was waiting for me to break. Instead, I set my fork down gently on the edge of my plate. The silver clinked against the porcelain, soft but sharp enough to draw a few eyes toward me. My pulse was steady, my breathing even. I reached for my phone beside my plate, sliding it into my hand without hurry. Mom kept her gaze fixed on Kelly, pretending she had not just thrown a dagger across the table. Dad shifted uncomfortably, his glass of wine half raised, his lips pressed tight. Grandma Eleanor's eyes lingered on me, sharp and knowing, as if she sensed something was coming. Around us, the conversation faltered and fell apart into uneasy silence. I unlocked my phone with a slow press of my thumb and tapped open the banking app. The glow of the screen reflected faintly on the silverware. My hands did not shake. I scrolled through the list of transfers that had lived in my history for years, each one a quiet act of sacrifice, each one a line in the story no one here seemed to know. I let the screen sit open as I looked up, meeting my mother's eyes. "Everyone wants to know what useless really looks like," I said softly, my voice calm and clear. "Let me show you." The room froze. The only sound was the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, steady and merciless. Mark lowered his fork, his expression puzzled. Kelly raised her brows, lips parting as if to laugh, but not quite finding the courage. My Aunt Susan leaned forward, her hand halfway to her mouth. No one spoke. No one even breathed too loudly. I placed the phone flat on the table beside my plate, the screen bright against the white tablecloth. Rows of numbers and dates filled the glass. I tapped the first one with the tip of my finger. September 15th. 2019. $1,200. Helen Miller. Car payment. Mom blinked rapidly, color rising in her cheeks. "That is not appropriate," she muttered, but her voice wavered. Dad turned his head sharply toward her. I tapped again. October 10th. 2019. $1,200. November 12th. The same. Every month for 2 years. $1,200. Sent directly from me to you. I said, "If that is useless, then perhaps useless means keeping your car from being repossessed." The silence deepened. The grandfather clock ticked louder. Kelly's smirk faltered, her eyes darting between Mom and me. Mark frowned, his brow knitting, but he said nothing. Grandma Eleanor's lips pressed into a line, her gaze fixed on her daughter. I scrolled further. June 10th. 2020. $5,000 to Springfield General Hospital. Dad's surgery. I said, my voice still even. Insurance did not cover it all. Remember who wrote the check? Mom. It was not Mark. It was not Kelly. It was me. Dad's face drained of color. He set his glass down heavily and stared at Mom. "Is that true?" he asked. She did not answer. She reached for her napkin instead, dabbing at her lips, but her hand trembled. I tapped again. July 12th. 2021. $2,500 to cover the bar exam fee. Kelly's fee. Because the trust fund had already gone to a trip through Europe, my eyes met hers across the table. Her cheeks flushed as she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "You passed." "Kelly, congratulations." I hope it felt as good as it should have. Knowing someone else quietly footed the bill, she opened her mouth as if to protest but closed it again. Her hand tightened around her wineglass. I could see her searching for words, but nothing came. Her silence was enough. And then, September 8th. 2021. $6,000. Loan payment. Mark's loan. Because his residency stipend was not enough, and the interest kept climbing, Mom asked me to take care of it so it would not embarrass you. Mark. And I did. Mark's face went pale. He stared at me. Then back at Mom. Then at his own hands. "I did not know," he whispered. His voice was barely audible. I thought Dad helped. Mom shifted in her seat, her pearls glinting under the chandelier. That is enough. Rachel, she said, her voice breaking on my name. Families help each other. There is no need to make a spectacle. A spectacle, I repeated calmly. You called me useless in front of everyone. You made a spectacle. All I am doing is telling the truth. If the truth embarrasses you, that is not my fault. The table was motionless. Uncle Frank set down his fork. Aunt Susan's hand hovered near her chest, and Grandma Eleanor's eyes burned with quiet fire. The tick of the grandfather clock filled the room again, each second heavier than the last. I let the silence stretch, let the weight of the numbers settle over them. My mother looked smaller somehow, her back stiff but her eyes darting. Trapped. I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands in my lap, and let the glow of the phone screen shine on the table. I had not raised my voice, had not shed a tear, had not begged for recognition. I had simply laid the facts in front of them, each number a stone in the foundation of a truth they could not ignore. The room was utterly still. For the first time, I did not feel invisible. Il felt indéniable. I scrolled back to the top of the screen and read aloud, my voice steady and deliberate. September 15th. 2019. $1,200. Car payment. October 15th. 2019. $1,200. Car payment. November 15th. 2019. $1,200. Car payment. For 2 years. Every single month. The words settled like stones in the room. No one moved. Dad's eyes flicked from the screen to Mom. Disbelief painted across his face. I kept going. June 10th. 2020. $5,000 to Springfield General Hospital. That was the surgery bill. The insurance only covered part of it, and I made up the difference. I glanced at Dad as I said it, and he swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the table, his lips parted. But no words came. Then, I scrolled further. July 12th. 2021. $2,500. Bar exam registration. Kelly's bar exam. Kelly's cheeks flushed red. She looked down quickly, pretending to adjust her napkin. I remembered wiring that money late at night, convincing myself it was worth it, that maybe Mom would finally say she was proud of me. But now, Kelly just sat there, silent, her glass half lifted but untouched. And then September 8th. 2021. $6,000. Loan repayment. Mark's student loans. Mark shifted in his chair, his face pale. His jaw tightened as he looked at me, then at Mom, then back again. I had never seen him speechless before. Finally, he muttered, I thought Dad helped with that. Mom's voice cut in, sharp but shaky. She is making this up. She is twisting everything. I turned the screen outward, holding it so everyone could see. Rows of transactions. The Wells Fargo logo in the corner. The digital receipts with my name. I angled it toward Aunt Susan. Here. Take a look. Do you want to verify the account number yourself? The color drained from Mom's face. Her hand shook as she reached for her wine again, but she set the glass back down before lifting it. Her voice came out thinner. Higher. Families help each other. Rachel, you didn't have to do any of this. I let the words hang. They sounded hollow even to her. Grandma Eleanor leaned forward, her old hands folded on the table. Her voice was low but firm. Patricia, is this true? Did you take her money? Mom opened and closed her mouth, searching for an excuse. We needed help. And Rachel always seemed stable. I thought she could manage it better than anyone. Stable, I repeated softly. Useless, but stable enough to pay everyone else's bills. The silence grew heavier. The smell of turkey and cinnamon rolls clung to the air, but no one touched their food. The bright ornaments on the tree glittered faintly in the background, mocking the suffocating tension at the table. Mark finally spoke again, his voice rough. $6,000. Rachel, that was you. I nodded once. Every cent. He ran a hand through his hair and sat back. Stunned. Kelly still would not look at me. Her thumb traced the rim of her wineglass in restless circles. Her face lowered. Uncle Frank broke the silence with a low whistle. All this time, we had no idea. I felt my chest rise and fall steadily. I was calm. Almost eerily calm. As if all those years of swallowing words had condensed into this one moment. I had not raised my voice. And I did not need to. The numbers spoke louder than anything I could have shouted. Mom tried again. Her voice breaking. You are humiliating this family. What will people think? Hearing this kind of talk at Christmas dinner, Grandma's eyes snapped to her daughter. What people think is not the issue. What I think is that you used your child like a bank account while telling her she was worthless. Dad finally found his voice. His hands were trembling as he pointed toward my phone. Patricia. She should never have had to do that. Not for me. Not for you. Not for anyone. My mother pressed her lips tight, her shoulders stiffening. I could see her struggling to hold on to the authority she always wielded at this table. But the evidence glowed brightly between us. I leaned back in my chair and folded my arms lightly. You wanted to know what useless looked like. I said quietly. Now you do. No one responded. The clock ticked again. Echoing down the hallway, my aunt stared at me with wide eyes. My uncle cleared his throat awkwardly. And Grandma did not look away from my mother. Mom's hand reached for her napkin again. Her fingers trembling, she whispered. Barely audible. You should have told us. I shook my head. I did tell you. I told you with every transfer. I told you with every sacrifice. You just never cared to listen. The room stayed frozen. Everyone suspended between disbelief and recognition. The truth sitting in plain sight on the white tablecloth. Undeniable at last. Dad's palm slammed against the table so hard that the silverware rattled and a fork clattered onto a plate. His voice thundered, raw with disbelief. Helen, you mean to tell me she has been paying our bills for 2 years, and you never told me? His face flushed crimson. The veins at his temples standing out, the room flinched at the sound. The Christmas lights flickering in the reflection of the wine glasses. My mother froze in her chair, her knuckles white as she gripped her napkin. Her eyes darted around the table, searching for sympathy. But none came. I did what I had to. Thomas, she stammered. We were drowning, and Rachel could afford it. Grandma Eleanor's voice sliced through the air, low but firm, carrying more weight than any of us could. You exploited the only one who has been saving this family. Her gaze never wavered, her silver hair glowing under the chandelier. Do you understand what you have done? Patricia, you have humiliated her in front of everyone and called her useless, when she has been the backbone all along. Every face at the table turned toward Mom. My aunts stared wide-eyed. My uncles shifted uncomfortably. My cousins whispered among themselves, their eyes flicking to me and back again. No one knew what to say, because the truth was already there, glowing on the screen of my phone. Kelly spoke next, her voice small, almost childlike. Mom, did you really make her pay for my exam? The bar mom's eyes softened toward her youngest, her voice faltering. Kelly, you needed it, and you had no other way. Rachel could handle it. She was always strong. Kelly's lips parted, but no words came. She looked at me, her face pale, and then back down at her plate. Mark leaned forward, his shoulders tight, his voice sharp. Handle it, you lied to me. Mom, you told me Dad paid my loans. His eyes flicked to me, shame and anger mixing in his features. $6,000. Rachel, that was you. I met his gaze and nodded once. He pressed his palms against his face, groaning into them before dropping his hands onto the table. I had no idea, he said hoarsely. All this time, I thought. His words trailed off into silence. Dad's chest heaved as he turned on Mom again. Patricia, you let me sit there thinking we were barely getting by. while our daughter drained herself dry. Do you know what that makes me feel like? As her father-mom tried to rally, straightening her back. Families help each other, she said weakly. I only asked because she was in the best position to give. No. Grandma interrupted sharply, her voice rising for the first time. You did not ask. You demanded. You drained her until she had nothing left, and you cloaked it in the language of family duty. Her hands trembled on the table, but her eyes blazed. That is not help. That is cruelty. The table erupted into murmurs, the tension breaking into scattered voices. Aun Susan muttert. My God. All this time, Uncle Frank shook his head, saying quietly, She has carried the whole family. Mom's eyes darted from face to face, her authority crumbling. She tried one last time, her tone defensive. Rachel could have said no. She chose this. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms loosely. I chose to love my family. I said evenly. I chose to believe that helping would finally make me enough. But that choice was used against me every single time you picked up the phone and asked for more. Mom's lip trembled, her eyes wet. That is not fair, she whispered. Dad slammed his hand on the table again, this time less in anger than in despair. Fair. He spat the word like it was poison. Do you know what is unfair? That you let her carry burdens that should have been ours? That you let me think our daughter was fine while she bled herself dry for us. He turned to me, his eyes glassy. I had no idea. Rachel. I should have known. My throat tightened. But I kept my composure. I pressed the side button on my phone, locking the screen, the numbers disappearing into blackness. The sound of it clicking shut seemed to echo louder than any voice. I set the phone down, pushed my chair back slowly, and rose to my feet. The scrape of the chair legs against the floor sliced through the murmurs. All eyes locked on me. My hands were steady as I picked up my purse. My voice was calm, low, and final. From now on, the bank of Rachel is permanently closed. The words fell into the center of the table with the weight of a verdict. No one moved at first. Then Aunt Susan gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Uncle Frank exhaled, shaking his head. My cousins stared, eyes wide, as if they had just seen the ground shift beneath them. Mark leaned back, guilt carved into his face. Kelly gripped her napkin, staring down, unable to meet my eyes. Mom pushed back her chair, her pearls rattling softly against the table. Rachel. Wait. Please. We can talk about this privately. I turned my head just enough to catch her gaze, my voice cold and unshakable. Privately is where this began. Publicly is where it ends. The sting of my words landed, and I saw her flinch. Grandma Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, her nod almost imperceptible. But he felt head approval. Dad lowered his head, shame pooling in his features, but his eyes met mine with something closer to sorrow than anger. I walked past the Christmas tree glittering with red and gold ornaments, past the untouched pumpkin pies sitting on the buffet, past the gifts stacked neatly in the corner. Each step was slow, deliberate, a rhythm I controlled. At the doorway, I stopped for a moment, the cold air slipping through the crack as I pulled on my coat. I turned back one last time. Mom stood rigid, her face stricken, the weight of the family's stares pressed down on her, their judgment finally visible. I did not speak again. I opened the door fully, and the winter air rushed in, sharp and cleansing. Behind me, the living room filled with voices, questions, accusations, disbelief. They rose like a storm, crashing into one another. But I left it behind. My boots sank into the snow on the walkway, crunching under the weight of each step. The night was still, the stars faint above the glowing rooftops of Springfield. I tightened my scarf and pulled the door shut behind me, sealing the chaos inside. For the first time, I was not leaving as the forgotten middle child, or the invisible daughter, or the so-called useless one. I was leaving on my own terms, carrying nothing but my truth and the freedom that came with it. I drove back to Boston that night, the highway quiet under the falling snow. The windshield wipers brushed steadily, the headlights stretching across the empty road. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, but my chest felt lighter than it had in years. The image of my mother's face when I said the words stayed with me, pale and trembling under the weight of the truth. For the first time, I did not feel guilty for walking away. I felt free. When I stepped into my apartment, the quiet wrapped around me like a blanket. I set my purse on the counter, took off my coat, and sank onto the couch without even turning on the lights. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, screen lighting up again and again with incoming calls. Helen Miller. My mother's name glowed relentlessly. I let it ring, the sound filling the dark room until it stopped. Then it started again. By midnight, the voicemails had piled up. I played one out of morbid curiosity. Her voice was sharp, angry. Rachel, how dare you humiliate me like that in front of everyone? Do you know what you've done to this family? The next one was softer, trembling. Rachel, please. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. You know I love you. Call me back. I deleted them all, one by one, my thumb pressing down with finality. The next morning, I woke to another flood of messages. This time, she alternated between rage and pleading. You're being selfish. Then minutes later, we can work this out. Sweetheart. I turned the phone face down and brewed a pot of coffee, trying to push the sound of her voice out of my head. 2 days later, David flew back from Portland earlier than planned. When I opened the door to see him standing there with his suitcase, his face full of concern, I nearly collapsed into his arms. He set the bag aside and pulled me close. Tell me everything, he said quietly. I told him about the dinner, the phone, the banking app glowing on the table, the way my father had slammed his hand down and demanded answers. I told him about the silence, the stares, the look on my mother's face when I said the bank was closed. His arms stayed wrapped around me, his hand stroking the back of my hair as I spoke. I'm proud of you, he whispered when I finished. You finally stood up for yourself. That night, I slept better than I had in years. His steady breathing beside me, the warmth of his hand resting on mine, reminded me that I was not alone in this anymore. Still, the phone never stopped ringing. My mother's voice filled the voicemail box each day, swinging between accusations and desperation. On December 27th, she snapped. This has gone far enough. You need to call me back right now. Hours later, she left another message, her voice breaking. Rachel, I don't know how to fix this. Please, just tell me what to do. I ignored them all. Then on the evening of December 28th, my phone lit up with a different name. Dad. I hesitated before answering, my chest tightening. When I pressed accept, his voice came through low and heavy. Rachel. It's me. I waited, unsure what he would say. I'm sorry, he said after a pause. I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you. That night at the table, when your mother called you useless, I should have stopped her. And for years before that, I should have defended you when she dismissed your work, your life, your worth. His voice cracked. I failed you as a father. The words stunned me into silence. I had never heard an apology from him before. Never once. My throat tightened, and I swallowed hard. Dad. You didn't know about the money. That's true, he admitted. But ignorance isn't an excuse. I let her control the conversation for too long. I thought staying quiet kept the peace, but all it did was make you carry everything alone. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, feeling the tears finally break free. Thank you, I whispered. It means more than you know. Hearing that from you, I could hear him breathing on the other end. Steady but heavy. I don't expect forgiveness right away, he said, but I need you to know that I see you now. I see everything you've done, and I am grateful. For a long moment, I sat curled on the couch, phone pressed to my ear, tears streaming down my cheeks, listening to my father's voice. The weight I had carried for so many years shifted slightly, not gone but lighter, as if someone else had finally picked up a piece of it. After we hung up, I sat in silence, my hands trembling in my lap. It was the first time in my life I had heard him choose me over her. The first time his loyalty bent toward truth instead of silence. It was not everything, but it was something. David came in from the kitchen, handing me a mug of tea. Mine. That was your dad, wasn't it? I nodded, unable to speak at first. He apologized. I finally whispered. David smiled softly, sitting beside me. Then, maybe this is the beginning of something new. The phone lay quiet on the coffee table for once. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, breathing in the steam. And for the first time since that night in Springfield, I felt the possibility of peace. January came with icy winds sweeping through Boston. But inside the agency where I worked, the atmosphere felt electric. I had been given the lead on a pitch for a major technology company. A contract that could put our team on the map in ways none of our previous clients. I threw myself into the project, sketching strategies late into the night, building presentations with a focus sharper than I had ever managed before. The sting of my mother's words had not disappeared, but I used it as fuel, reshaping it into determination. The morning of the presentation, I stood in front of the conference room in my navy suit, the slides glowing behind me. Executives from the tech firm sat in a neat row, their pens tapping quietly on the glossy table. My voice carried steady and confident as I laid out the campaign, every detail precise. When I finished, silence filled the room for a heartbeat before one of them leaned forward and said, "This is bold. Exactly what we need." 2 weeks later, the company signed the deal. It was the largest contract the agency had ever secured. My boss, Michelle, pulled me aside after the announcement, her smile wide. "Rachel, I have seen you work hard for years. But lately you are different, more confident, more decisive. Whatever has changed, keep it. It is making you unstoppable." Her words echoed in my mind as I rode the subway home that evening. For so long I had measured my worth by my family's recognition. Now, in a glass tower in Boston, I was being told by people who saw my actual work that I was powerful, effective, respected. I felt the ground shift beneath me, steadying in a way it never had before. Meanwhile, the fallout from Christmas did not stay buried. By the second week of January, I heard from Dad that they had started seeing a financial counselor. His name was Alan Cooper, a lawyer who specialized in debt management and estate planning. Dad told me in a quiet voice over the phone that he had insisted on it, that things could not continue the way they had. 3 weeks after Christmas, I agreed to attend one of the sessions, not to save them, not to pay another cent, but to hear what was being said when the mask of holiday performance was gone. The office was in downtown Springfield, in a modest brick building, with frosted glass windows and neatly stacked files lining the shelves. I arrived early, sitting in the waiting room with a magazine I did not read. When my parents walked in, Mom's eyes flicked toward me before darting away. She sat down stiffly, her coat buttoned to the throat. Dad looked tired, his shoulders sagging as he lowered himself into the chair beside her. Alan Cooper appeared a few minutes later, a calm man in his 50s with a kind but direct manner. Inside his office, he gestured for us to sit around the polished wooden table. Papers were spread out in front of him, numbers highlighted in neat columns. He cleared his throat. "The reality is simple. This household has been relying on outside funds for years, and without Rachel's contributions, you would be in significant debt." The words landed like stones in the room. Dad nodded slowly, his hands folded in his lap. "Mom satt rigid," her jaw tight. Alan continued, "Your daughter carried more than $30,000 in payments on your behalf. That is not sustainable, and it is not fair." I stayed silent, my hands resting calmly in my lap, watching as the truth unfolded from someone else's mouth this time. Mom finally spoke, her voice brittle. "We never forced her. She wanted to help." Alan leaned forward, his eyes steady on hers. "Wanting to help is not the same as being expected to. From what I see here, Rachel covered car payments, medical bills, exam fees, and loans. That is not occasional generosity. That is systematic dependence. The silence stretched. Dad rubbed his forehead, his voice low. Patricia. He is right. She should never have had to carry this. Mom's eyes flicked toward me. And for the first time in my life, I saw something I had never seen before. Not anger, not dismissal, but hesitation. Her voice shook. I did not realize how much it was. Alan pushed the papers closer to her. It is all here. Every transaction. You may not have realized, but the numbers do not lie. I sat still, listening. My breath even. It was not my job to speak this time. My role was simply to hear it confirmed in a space where denial could not survive. Mom's shoulders slumped slightly, her eyes falling to the table. The room was silent except for the hum of the heater. Finally, she whispered, barely audible. I suppose I leaned on her more than I should have. Aunt Susan had once told me that humility looked foreign on my mother. Like a borrowed coat she did not know how to wear, sitting in that office. I understood what she meant. Watching my mother's head bow, her defenses cracking under the weight of undeniable truth, felt surreal. For years she had stood taller by stepping on me. Now, at last, she was being forced to look up at the damage she had done. Dad exhaled slowly, his voice softer than I had expected. Rachel, I do not know how to fix all of this, but I want you to know I am proud of you. Not for the money, not for what you gave, but for who you are. I nodded once. Unable to speak past the tightness in my throat, Alan folded the papers into a neat stack. The next step is clear. No more borrowing from Rachel. You need to adjust your lifestyle, cut expenses, and rebuild responsibly. He looked at both of them, his tone firm. She is not your safety net anymore. I felt something shift inside me as those words echoed in the room. The truth was no longer just mine to carry. It was written down, spoken aloud, acknowledged by everyone present. For the first time, I did not have to defend myself. I only had to sit back and watch as my mother lowered her gaze to the polished wood. Unable to meet anyone's eyes. It was not triumph I felt, but release. A quiet, steady release that washed over me like fresh air after years of suffocation. When the meeting ended, I stepped outside into the cold air of Springfield. Snow crunched under my boots. The sky a pale winter gray. I tightened my coat around me and let the wind sting my face. It was not reconciliation. Not yet. But it was the first time I had seen my mother bow her head in front of the truth. And that was enough for now. By the time spring arrived, wedding planning had taken over my weekends. David and I had chosen a small inn in the White Mountains of New Hampshire for our ceremony. A place surrounded by evergreens, and a view of the valley that reminded me of the overlook where he had proposed. We wanted something intimate, filled with people who had truly supported us. Not a performance for an audience that measured worth in appearances. It did not take long for my mother to try inserting herself into every detail. One Saturday morning she called me while I was at the bridal boutique in Boston. I had just slipped into a simple gown with lace along the shoulders when her voice came sharp through the phone. Rachel, that dress is too plain. You need something more traditional. More elegant. Brides should look timeless, not ordinary. I looked at myself in the mirror, the gown flowing softly to the floor, David's sister beaming behind me. He felt comfortable, beautiful even, which was something I had not felt often in my mother's presence. I took a breath and answered evenly, Mom, this is not your wedding. It is mine. There was a pause, then a scoff. People will talk, she said. They will think you settled. I smiled faintly at my reflection, brushing a hand over the lace. Let them talk. The only person I need to please is myself. And the man waiting at the end of the aisle. Her silence on the other end was almost satisfying. She did not argue again, though I knew she wanted to. As the weeks passed, the interference did not stop. She sent me lists of family friends I should invite. People I barely knew. Insisting they had always expected to be included, she even hinted that the menu should reflect refinement. suggesting I cut David's choice of barbecue appetizers. Each time, I gave her the same calm reply. This is the wedding of David and me. No one else. One evening, while we finalized the guest list, David reached over and squeezed my hand. I am proud of you, he said. A year ago, you might have given in just to keep the peace. He was right. Something inside me had shifted. Boundaries that once felt impossible now came naturally. I had learned that keeping the peace had cost me too much. And this time, I would not trade my joy for someone else's approval. The wedding day arrived with clear skies and the soft scent of pine in the air. The inn glowed with string lights and candles. Tables set with white linens and vases of wildflowers. My friends laughed in the bridal suite as I got ready, their voices warm and steadying. My father knocked gently before stepping in, his eyes misting when he saw me in my gown. You look radiant, he whispered. When it was time to walk down the aisle, the doors opened and the music swelled. David stood waiting, his face breaking into the smile that had always made me feel seen. As I walked arm in arm with my father, I noticed my mother in the front row. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on me, her expression unreadable. The ceremony passed in a blur of vows and promises, laughter and tears. When we were finally pronounced husband and wife, the room erupted into applause. I caught a glimpse of my grandmother's proud smile, my aunt dabbing her eyes, and even my brother Mark, clapping with genuine warmth. Kelly sat quietly, but her expression was softer than I expected. At the reception, after the first dances and plates of food passed around, my father stood and raised his glass. The chatter dimmed as he cleared his throat. Rachel has always been the heart of this family. Even when we did not see it clearly, she has carried more than her share, given more than anyone should be asked to, and she has done it with grace. David, you are not just marrying my daughter, you are marrying the strongest, kindest woman I know. The room filled with the sound of clinking glasses and applause. My chest tightened as the words washed over me. For so long, I had longed for acknowledgement, and now it came publicly. Sincerely. From the one person who had once stood silent, I glanced at my mother. Her eyes glistened as she pressed a napkin to her cheek. She did not look up, did not speak, but I saw the movement of her shoulders as she exhaled heavily. For the first time, she seemed to accept that I was no longer the invisible child she could dismiss. The night went on with laughter, music, and dancing. For me, the highlight was not the speeches or the photographs, but the moment on the dance floor when David spun me under the soft lights and whispered, "This is your life now. Ours. No one else gets to write it for you." I rested my head against his shoulder, the hum of voices and the beat of music surrounding us. For the first time, I felt not only loved, but firmly rooted in my own worth. And as I caught sight of my mother, wiping away another tear, I knew she finally saw it too. A year later, David and I closed on a small house just outside Boston. A 2-story colonial with white shutters and a maple tree in the front yard. The first night we slept there, we sat on the living room floor, surrounded by unopened boxes, eating takeout pizza off paper plates. I remember looking around at the bare walls, the soft glow of a single lamp, and thinking, this is ours. Not borrowed, not earned at the cost of someone else's approval, but built by our own choices. The months that followed were filled with simple joys I had once thought were out of reach. I watched our savings account grow steadily because I was no longer funneling money into someone else's crises. I bought curtains without checking my balance twice. I planned weekend trips with David. And for the first time, I was not secretly calculating how much I would have to cut from my own grocery budget to afford it. At work, the confidence I had carried into that winter only deepened. I led campaigns for clients I had once thought were out of my league. My team grew under my direction, and Michelle began hinting at a director role on the horizon. One afternoon, after I presented a successful campaign to a group of investors, she pulled me aside and said, "Rachel, you are exactly where you belong." Those words stayed with me longer than she probably realized. Family gatherings looked different too. After the Christmas dinner that shattered everything, my parents had kept their distance for months. By late spring, Dad began reaching out more. Sometimes with short calls. Sometimes just to share a story about his woodworking projects. Kelly and Mark were polite but cautious, as if still unsure how to navigate the new version of me. And Mom, well, she was quieter than I had ever known her to be. The call that surprised me most came one warm June evening. I was in the kitchen unpacking groceries when the phone rang. I nearly let it go to voicemail when I saw her name. But something inside me told me to answer. Rachel. It's Mom. Her voice was softer than I remembered, carrying an edge of hesitation. I wanted to tell you something. I braced myself, unsure what was coming. I am proud of you. I do not think I ever said that before. Not the way I should have. You have built a life that is yours, and it is beautiful. For a moment I could not speak. I leaned against the counter, the grocery bag slipping slightly from my hand. My mother, the woman who had once called me useless in front of a crowded table, was now telling me she was proud. I closed my eyes, steadying my breath. Thank you, I said finally. I do not need to hear it anymore, but I appreciate that you said it. There was silence on the other end. Then a shaky exhale. I love you, Rachel. I smiled faintly, though tears blurred my vision. I love you too, Mom. When I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring out at the maple tree swaying in the summer breeze. It was not about finally winning her approval. It was about realizing I had grown strong enough that her words, whether praise or criticism, no longer define me. The greatest lesson I had learned from that Christmas night was simple but powerful. Boundaries are not walls to shut people out, but doors that you choose when and how to open. Saying no is not cruelty. It is protection. And love without respect is not love worth keeping. As I looked around the house, David and I were filling with our own laughter, our own traditions. I felt a deep, steady peace. I had been called useless, overlooked, and dismissed, but I had turned all of that into fuel for a life I was proud of. If you have ever felt invisible, if you have ever been told you were less than what you know yourself to be, remember this. You have the right to teach people how to treat you. You have the right to say no, to set boundaries, to demand respect. And if my story touched you in some way, share where you are watching from, leave a like, and subscribe for more stories about strength, family, and self-worth. Together we can remind each other that no one is too small to rise, and no one is too useless to matter.